At 1:41 a.m. local time, the war stopped being primarily about strikes, proxies, and rhetoric, and pivoted to a single word that can reshape the global economy overnight: blockade. According to the BBC headline you're seeing, Trump says the United States will blockade the Strait of Hormuz after talks failed over Iran's nuclear ambitions. If that is the posture now being publicly signaled, then the conflict has crossed into a different category of risk. Because a Hormuz blockade is not just another escalation step. It is a strategic threshold, the moment a regional standoff begins behaving like a global crisis. And here's why. You can argue endlessly about whose strikes were justified, whose threats were credible, and whose negotiations were sincere. But when the Strait of Hormuz becomes the tool, the argument stops being regional. It becomes structural. Hormuz is where military coercion turns into immediate economic consequence. It is where a naval posture decision can move oil prices, shipping insurance, allied cohesion, and domestic politics in a dozen countries before the first ship has ever stopped. So tonight, I'm going to explain what this actually means, beyond the headline. It means the U.S. is signaling it may try to impose maritime denial as leverage after diplomatic failure, which is a classic move when ground truth is messy and time is running out. It means Iran will now be forced to choose between conceding under maritime pressure or demonstrating that maritime pressure has costs. It means every Gulf state, every major energy importer, every shipping insurer, and every allied capital is about to treat this conflict as a global economic security event, because that's what Hormuz does. And it means the next 48 to 72 hours will be defined less by what leaders say and more by what ships, aircraft insurers, and naval commanders do in response to a single question. Is blockade a political threat or an operational plan? Start with the most important clarification. Blockade is not a casual word in international security. In practice, it implies either a declared maritime exclusion regime or a physical enforcement posture designed to prevent certain vessels, cargoes, or states from using the strait. And the moment you publicly frame Hormuz in that language, you create three consequences immediately. First, you raise the perceived probability of a direct naval confrontation. Second, you inject uncertainty into a shipping corridor that runs on confidence. Third, you shift the crisis from who hit what to who controls the system. That system, energy flow, shipping flow, insurance pricing, and regional stability, doesn't wait for diplomats to argue. It reacts. Now, why would talks fail over nuclear ambitions and lead to this kind of threat? Because nuclear negotiations, more than almost any other kind of negotiation, collapse on trust and verification. If one side believes the other is pursuing capability it cannot accept, then talks stop being about compromise and start being about coercion. And coercion seeks pressure points. Hormuz is the pressure point that reaches beyond the battlefield into global life. But here's the trap. The more effective a pressure point is economically, the harder it is to use without triggering a chain reaction you may not be able to control. That's why this matters. What a Hormuz blockade really signals. A Hormuz blockade threat is essentially saying, if we can't get what we want through talks, we will impose costs through the system. It is coercion through denial, denial of access, denial of predictability, denial of economic normalcy. That is not a small escalation. Because if you threaten Hormuz, you're not just threatening Iran. You're threatening every economy dependent on stable energy flows and commercial shipping. That includes U.S. partners. That includes countries not involved in the conflict. That includes governments that will now pressure Washington to clarify, constrain, or justify what blockade means in practice. So the threat has two audiences. Audience one is Tehran. Audience two is everyone else whose economy and politics will be hit if Hormuz becomes unstable. And that second audience creates a new constraint. Once you move the battlefield into a global choke point, you inherit global pressure. Now, let's talk about why this threat emerges right after talks fail. It's not random, it's a pattern. When negotiations collapse, leaders often shift to a tool that does three things simultaneously. It signals seriousness, it creates immediate leverage without needing large new strikes, it changes the cost curve for the opponent quickly. Hormuz does all three. But it also creates a fourth outcome. It changes the cost curve for the entire region and global economy too. That's why it's dangerous. The strategic collision, nuclear standoff, plus maritime coercion. A nuclear standoff is about capability and verification. A maritime coercion campaign is about pressure and endurance. When you fuse them, you get a conflict where escalation incentives rise rapidly because each side believes the other side is threatening something existential. For Washington, nuclear ambitions can be framed as an unacceptable strategic outcome. For Tehran, a Hormuz blockade can be framed as an unacceptable act of coercion that threatens sovereignty and survival. That pairing is unstable because both sides can justify escalation as defensive. One side says it is preventing nuclear breakout. The other says it is preventing economic strangulation. That is exactly how conflicts widen. Both sides believe they are preventing a worse future. Now, what does Iran do in response to a blockade threat? This is where analysis matters, because the wrong assumption is that Iran has only two options: submit or fight. In reality, Iran's options are layered. It can respond militarily, economically, diplomatically, and informationally, often choosing actions that raise cost while attempting to avoid a direct threshold crossing that triggers full-scale war. And that means the blockade threat does not produce a simple response. It produces a response spectrum. But before we even get to Iran's response, we need to understand the most important operational reality. A blockade is not a switch. It's a posture. It requires sustained enforcement. It requires rules. It requires identification. It requires escalation management. And it introduces constant risk of incident. Because every ship that approaches becomes a decision: allow, warn, inspect, divert, detain, or confront. Every decision becomes politically loaded. Every confrontation becomes a headline. Every headline becomes market movement, which brings us to the hidden driver of this crisis: the information domain. The information war begins the moment blockade is spoken. The first battle in a Hormuz crisis is not a naval battle, it is a narrative battle. Who is framed as threatening global stability? Who is framed as defending international order? Who is framed as escalating? Who is framed as desperate? The U.S. will try to frame blockade language as lawful coercion to prevent nuclear risk and protect maritime stability. Iran will try to frame it as economic warfare and collective punishment. Each side will recruit international opinion because international opinion affects insurance, shipping behavior, partner support, and domestic political space. This is why the headline is strategic. It is not only informing, it is positioning. Defense math: why Hormuz is leverage and why it's hard to control. Here's the defense math that makes Hormuz both powerful and dangerous. Defending free passage requires constant resources: ships, aircraft, surveillance, command and control, partner coordination, and readiness. The defender pays for certainty. Creating uncertainty can be cheaper. The disruptor doesn't need to close the strait permanently. It only needs to make passage feel unsafe enough that the economic system reacts. Premiums rise, routes change, delays compound, and prices spike. That asymmetry is why Hormuz is leverage. But it also means the moment Washington threatens blockade, Iran does not necessarily need to win a naval war to create pain. It can seek to raise perceived risk and cost in ways that trigger economic effects even without prolonged direct confrontation. And that is why blockade threats are high stakes. They move the contest into a domain where perception is as consequential as action. Now let's translate this into what each actor is likely calculating tonight. Washington's calculation: if talks failed, Washington's challenge is this: how do you create leverage that is strong enough to change Iranian behavior without dragging the U.S. into an open-ended conflict whose costs outrun its benefits? A blockade threat serves that purpose rhetorically. It implies overwhelming control. It implies consequence. It implies that if Iran won't accept terms on the nuclear file, then the U.S. will use a global chokepoint to force cost. But that rhetoric must now confront the operational question: how do you enforce pressure without turning the strait into a continuous incident generator? Because continuous incidents create domestic political risk, allied political risk, and market instability. And market instability quickly becomes political instability. So Washington is likely trying to do two things at once: maximize Iranian fear of cost, minimize everyone else's fear that the strait will become chaotic. That's a difficult balancing act, especially when blockade is used publicly, because that word alone increases fear. Iran's calculation begins with deterrence and sovereignty. If Iran appears to concede under blockade threat, it risks domestic and strategic damage. It also risks creating a precedent that maritime coercion can extract nuclear concessions. So Tehran's incentive is to show that maritime coercion is not free. But it must also avoid a move that gives the U.S. and partners an easy justification for overwhelming escalation. That pushes Iran toward responses that create cost while maintaining enough ambiguity to manage escalation thresholds. It may use diplomatic framing, information warfare, proxy activation, cyber pressure, or calibrated maritime signaling designed to raise the cost of enforcement while avoiding a single catastrophic act that unifies the world against it. This is not weakness. It is modern coercion logic. The Gulf states calculation. Gulf states are the immediate exposure zone. They have infrastructure, ports, refineries, water systems, and commercial credibility tied to stability. A Hormuz crisis is not abstract for them. It is existential. They will likely demand clarity. They will harden security. They will coordinate quietly. And they will try to avoid being forced to choose between alliance commitments and domestic economic risk. This is where blockade becomes diplomatically explosive. It can force regional partners into uncomfortable positions, especially if the crisis drags on. The global economy's calculation markets do not wait for verification. They price risk. The moment blockade language is introduced, the system asks, how likely is shipping disruption? How long could it last? What is the worst case scenario? How quickly would inventories absorb shock? And because markets operate on probability and narrative, not on confirmed damage alone, the mere credibility of the threat can move prices. That means the US is now in a contest not only with Iran, but with market psychology. If it wants leverage without chaos, it must control narrative and signal stability, even while threatening denial. That is difficult. What talks failed actually means, here talks failing over nuclear ambitions, is the kind of phrasing that implies a hard gap on verification and end state. That can mean the US demanded limits Iran rejected as unacceptable. Iran demanded guarantees the US rejected as unacceptable. Or both sides concluded the other's position was not credible. In any of those scenarios, the failure is not purely diplomatic, it is strategic. Because nuclear-related disputes compress time, they create urgency, they reduce tolerance for ambiguity, and they increase the temptation to use coercive tools quickly rather than wait. That is why blockade rhetoric follows quickly after failure. It suggests an attempt to replace negotiation leverage with enforcement leverage, the escalation ladder. How this can get worse fast. Once Hormuz becomes central, the escalation ladder changes shape. The ladder becomes more sensitive to incidents because the domain is crowded with commercial vessels, multiple navies, surveillance systems, and actors with different rules of engagement. The risks increase in 5 ways: misidentification and miscommunication, overreaction to ambiguous events, commercial panic causing real economic disruption, spoiler actions designed to force escalation, domestic political pressure that reduces leaders' room to de-escalate. In other words, this is not a controlled chess match. It is a crowded system under tension. And that is why blockade threats can backfire. They can create a situation where both sides feel compelled to prove resolve in a domain where accidents and misreads are more likely. The blockade word also creates a credibility trap. If a leader says blockade, and then nothing happens operationally, the threat looks hollow. If the threat looks hollow, deterrence weakens, and future coercion becomes harder. That creates pressure to act. Do we see official statements that define rules, inspection regimes, exclusion zones, warnings to shipping? Even limited procedural language indicates the system is being prepared for enforcement. Watch 2, commercial behavior. Do insurers raise premiums? Do tankers reroute? Do ports slow? Often, commercial behavior changes before governments admit the risk. Watch 3, naval repositioning. Visible shifts in naval posture are signals of seriousness. Even without tactical details, changes in presence, escorts, and patrol patterns will show whether the threat is moving from language to posture. Watch 4. Iranian messaging and counterframing. Does Tehran emphasize economic warfare and call for international reaction? Or does it issue specific counterwarnings? The tone will reveal whether Iran is trying to internationalize pressure or preparing for direct confrontation. Watch 5. Side fronts. When Hormuz becomes central, side fronts can flare because they become bargaining chips. A spike in proxy activity or side front incidents may indicate leverage. Warfare is expanding beyond maritime. Watch 6, oil price and volatility. It's not the absolute price that matters, it's volatility. Volatility indicates markets believe the situation is unstable and unpredictable, which increases political pressure on all governments involved. Watch 7, back-channel signs. Even when public talks fail, private channels often continue. Watch for procedural language like contacts continue, technical teams, or intermediaries. If those disappear entirely, the breakdown is harder. Bottom line, a U.S. threat to blockade the Strait of Hormuz after talks collapse over Iran's nuclear ambitions is not just a new headline. It is a shift in the conflict's logic, from strike-for-strike dynamics to system-level economic coercion. In one line, if Hormuz becomes the lever, the war becomes global, because the chokepoint connects regional escalation to worldwide consequence faster than any other domain. This does not guarantee that a blockade will be executed exactly as the word suggests, but it does mean the escalation space has widened dramatically. It means markets will react, allies will pressure, Iran will look for counter-leverage, and the risk of incident will rise. The talks failed. The leverage shifted. And the next phase will be decided not by what people claim on cameras, but by what ships do in the strait, what insurers do in markets, and what commanders do when the first ambiguous event appears. Watch the next 48 to 72 hours. That's the window where rhetoric either becomes posture or collapses back into negotiation under a different name.